At dinner, my husband slid a banking token across the table and quietly told me to transfer his entire $43 million fortune to my private account just to be safe. He died 43 hours later. Before the dirt on his grave settled, his son and his corporate lawyer wife were standing on my porch with a corrupt attorney ready to throw me onto the street. They thought they were evicting a naive trophy wife. They had no idea they just declared war on a forensic accountant holding the keys to their destruction. My name is Chloe. I am 33 years old and standing in the driveway of the estate I shared with my late husband. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart people who underestimated your intelligence. It had been exactly 2 hours since the funeral ended. The scent of white lilies clung to my mourning dress, a constant reminder of the nightmare I was living. My husband Richard was a titan in the commercial real estate world. At 68, his sudden fatal heart attack shattered my world. I drove right back to our home seeking the quiet sanctuary of the life we built together. Instead, I pulled up to the main gate to find a barricade. My 3 suitcases were stacked haphazardly on the porch steps. Standing at the top of the stairs, blocking the heavy oak doors, were 3 people. Julian was Richard's 39-year-old son from his first marriage. Maya was his stunning 37-year-old wife, who also happened to be a ruthless corporate defense attorney. And Marcus was the corrupt family lawyer. Julian did not wait for me to step out of my car before starting his assault. He marched down the concrete steps, grabbed the spare keys I kept on the porch, and hurled them directly into the thorny rose bushes. "The grieving widow act is over," he sneered. "Dad is gone, and so is your free ride now. You can stop pretending." I stood there letting the cool wind whip against my face. For 4 years, Julian had treated me like a calculating gold digger. He could never fathom this. He ignored the fact that Richard and I originally met while I was auditing one of his subsidiary companies. I was a forensic accountant. I spent my days hunting down missing funds, unraveling fraud, and finding hidden money. But to Julian, I was just a parasite. Maya stepped forward, descending 1 step so she was looking down at me. She wore a flawless charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than my first car. Her posture was rigid, her expression entirely devoid of sympathy. She held out a thick manila folder, tapping her long manicured nails. "Richard signed this prenuptial agreement 10 years ago," Maya said, her voice a smooth, calculated weapon. "Long before your little charm offensive scrambled his brains. Under Section 4, Paragraph B, any property acquired prior to the marriage defaults to his sole biological heir. That means this house. That means absolutely everything. You have 30 minutes to leave here before I have you arrested for trespassing." I looked from Maya to Marcus, who stood silently in the background, refusing to meet my eyes. Marcus drafted our actual updated prenup 2 years ago. It was a rock-solid document that legally granted me half the estate. The fact that he was standing there silently letting Maya present an invalidated document meant they had paid him off heavily. They fully expected me to break down crying, to beg for a few days, to pack my things, to just panic. I looked at my suitcases sitting on the cold concrete. They had gone into my master bedroom, rummaged through my intimate belongings, and thrown my life into bags while I was standing over a casket saying goodbye to my husband. The sheer cruelty of it was breathtaking. Maya watched me closely, a victorious smirk playing on her lips. She was an ambitious African-American woman who fought to conquer the corporate legal world. She honestly believed I was just a pretty face who conned her father-in-law. "Did you really think a glorified calculator could outsmart a partner at a top-tier law firm?" Maya asked, her voice dropping to a harsh, mocking whisper. "Go back to your cubicle now, Chloe. You do not belong in this tax bracket." I took a slow, deep breath. The dark fabric of my dress rustled in the wind. I did not scream. I did not cry. Crying was for people who did not have a contingency plan. In my coat pocket, my phone suddenly vibrated against my hip. A single long buzz. It was a custom banking alert I had set up precisely for this moment. 43 hours ago, during our last dinner, Richard had been sweating profusely. He slowly slid a small black banking token across the tablecloth and ordered me to transfer $43 million from a hidden offshore account into my private sole proprietorship account. He told me to do it right then at the table, refusing to explain. He only whispered that they were coming and that I needed to be safe. That vibration meant the international wire transfer had just cleared the final security checks. $43 million was now sitting securely in an account completely disconnected from the Richard estate. Julian and Maya thought they were leaving me penniless on the street. They thought they had seized the entire empire. They were so busy gloating over stealing a house that they had no idea the real war had not even started. I grabbed the handles of my suitcases. I turned my back on them without saying a single word. I had a quiet hotel room to check into and a massive financial discrepancy to hunt down. I sat in the back of the hired town car, watching the heavy wrought iron gates of the estate disappear in the rearview mirror. I did not look back again. My mind was already moving backward in time, precisely 43 hours ago. The hotel lobby I eventually walked into was a blur of polished marble and low ambient lighting, but my head was entirely trapped in the memory of my very last dinner with Richard. We were sitting in a secluded booth at our favorite Italian restaurant downtown. The atmosphere was supposed to be romantic, but Richard had barely touched his meal. His face was a sickly shade of gray, and heavy sweat beaded on his forehead, despite the cool air conditioning. I had reached across the table to check his pulse, genuinely thinking he was having an issue with his blood pressure. Instead, he grabbed my wrist with a grip so incredibly tight it bruised my skin. With his other hand, he pulled a small black secure banking token from his suit pocket and slid it across the white tablecloth. He looked frantically over his shoulder before leaning in close. His breath was ragged and uneven. "Transfer it all to your private offshore account, Chloe," he whispered, his eyes wide with an absolute terror I had never seen in him before. "Do it right now under the table. Do not tell Julian. They are coming." I had opened my secure banking app on my phone beneath the table, hiding the screen from view. I took the token, typed in the complex encryption keys, and authorized the transfer. I moved exactly $43 million out of his personal holdings. He refused to say another word on the quiet ride home. He died in our bed just a few hours later. I walked into the upscale downtown hotel room and dropped my bags in the corner of the large suite. I did not bother turning on the overhead lights. I sat on the edge of the unmade bed and pulled my heavy laptop from my leather tote bag. As a forensic accountant, I spent my entire professional career dismantling complex corporate shells, tracing hidden assets, and exposing financial lies. Julian and Maya thought I was just a naive woman who spent her days picking out expensive curtain fabrics and planning dinner parties. They completely forgot that I still had full administrative access to the back-end ledgers of Richard's parent company. The laptop screen bathed the dark hotel room in a harsh blue glow as my specialized software began decrypting the financial architecture of the real estate empire Julian was so desperate to claim. I ran a standard liquidity diagnostic on the primary holdings. The progress bar loaded across the screen, then instantly flashed a bright red warning. I ran it again, thinking the servers were down or there was a glitch in the secure connection. They were not down. The accounts were completely empty. The massive corporate accounts holding the operating capital for Richard's commercial properties had been methodically drained over the last 6 months. It was a masterpiece of financial camouflage. Millions upon millions of dollars had been funneled through dummy corporations, carefully categorized as phantom construction costs and offshore consulting fees. Julian did not just inherit a massive real estate empire. He inherited a rotting corpse of a company on the verge of total financial collapse. And Richard knew it. That was exactly why he gave me the only clean money left to his name. My cell phone vibrated violently against the wooden nightstand, breaking the heavy silence of the room. The caller ID flashed Maya's name. I accepted the call, bringing the phone to my ear without saying a single word. "I hope you found a comfortable little motel," Chloe Maya said, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy. Julian wanted to send your clothes out to you in black garbage bags, but I told him we had to remain civilized despite your behavior. What do you want, Maya? I asked, keeping my tone dead flat and emotionless. I want to give you some free legal advice, she replied, the smugness practically radiating through the speaker. Julian is incredibly angry. He feels you manipulated his sick father during his final years to get a comfortable lifestyle. As the family attorney, I have already drafted a preliminary lawsuit against you for elder abuse and financial coercion. If you try to contest the eviction or make a single claim on any of Richard's properties, I will file it tomorrow morning. I will drag your name through the mud. I will make sure no reputable accounting firm in this country ever hires you again. You will spend the next decade drowning in suffocating legal fees. Walk away quietly right now, and maybe I will let you keep the cheap jewelry he bought you. She paused, waiting for me to cry, waiting for me to beg her for mercy. I just stared at the empty financial ledgers glowing on my laptop screen. You are remarkably confident for someone sitting in a house they do not actually own, Maya, I said softly. I ended the call before she could formulate a response and tossed the phone onto the bed. Keep it locked down tight, I replied, keeping my voice a low murmur. Do not authorize any outbound transfers unless you hear my voice and my specific passcode. Understood, madam. I ended the call and slipped the burner phone back into my bag. I leaned back against the leather booth, staring out the window at the busy city street. The money was incredibly safe. Maya and Julian thought they had backed me into a corner, but they had only succeeded in proving how utterly terrified they were. They froze my domestic accounts because they knew the corporate parent accounts were drained. But they did not drain them, and I certainly did not drain them. Richard had emptied his own companies. He had systematically dismantled his own life work, pulled out the only $43 million of clean money left, and handed it to me in his final hours. He knew Maya and Julian were running some kind of massive catastrophic fraud through his subsidiaries. I took a slow sip of my coffee, feeling a cold, razor-sharp focus settle over my mind. The money was just the beginning. Now I needed to find out exactly why my husband had to hide it. Less than 2 hours later, an email notification flashed across the screen of my burner phone. It was a formal digital summons from Marcus, legally mandating my presence at the estate for the emergency reading of Richard's updated last will and testament. They were not satisfied with simply locking me out of my bank accounts or tossing my suitcases onto the driveway. Maya and Julian wanted to make my defeat a public spectacle. They needed an audience to witness their absolute victory. I finished my coffee, smoothed the wrinkles from my black morning suit, and walked outside to hail a cab. I was heading straight back into the lion's den. When I stepped through the heavy mahogany double doors of the estate, the sheer volume of people in the foyer surprised me. The grand dining room was packed to the brim. Extended family members I had not seen since our wedding day were hovering around the catered buffet, like well-dressed vultures waiting for their cut of the scraps. The atmosphere did not feel like a solemn gathering to honor a man who had died just 2 days ago. It felt like a corporate victory party. The moment I walked into the room, the low hum of conversation stopped entirely. Aunt Clara, with her heavy pearl necklace and sharp, judgmental eyes, immediately sneered. She turned to Maya and spoke loudly enough for the entire room to hear. Has she already started packing for her return to that cheap little walk-up apartment she lived in before Richard rescued her? Clara asked, her voice dripping with pure condescension. I cannot imagine she will be able to afford the rent in this zip code anymore. Julian was standing by the grand stone fireplace, nursing a heavy crystal glass of expensive scotch. He laughed loudly at Clara's comment, stepping forward to command the center of the room. He pointed his glass directly at me, reminding the entire gathered family exactly where I came from. Do not be too hard on her, Aunt Clara. Julian mocked, his voice booming off the high vaulted ceilings. She was just a middle-class junior auditor counting paper clips and crunching numbers in a tiny cubicle before my father took pity on her. You had a good run, Chloe. You got to wear the designer clothes and play the society wife for 4 years. You should be down on your knees thanking us for the charity. Now be a good girl and leave before things get ugly. I ignored his taunts and walked past him, keeping my posture perfectly straight. I took a seat at the very far end of the long, polished dining table, far away from the celebrating crowd. Marcus stood at the head of the table, opening a thick leather-bound folder with an air of immense self-importance. Maya stood right behind him, her arms crossed, monitoring his every single move to ensure her perfectly crafted legal trap sprang shut, exactly as planned. "Take your seats," Marcus instructed the room. "We are here to formally execute the final wishes of Richard Thorne." According to the dense legal document Marcus read aloud, Richard had allegedly signed a brand new will just weeks before his death. The document completely invalidated our previous prenuptial agreement and stripped me of my right to the estate. The room grew dead silent as Marcus finally reached the core distribution of assets. Marcus proudly announced that Julian Thorne was named the sole and exclusive heir to Thorne Global Real Estate. He was inheriting the parent company that controlled every single commercial property, residential development, and liquid asset in Richard's massive portfolio. Julian puffed out his chest, his smug smile stretching from ear to ear. The extended family broke into a round of polite applause, offering their immediate congratulations to the new king of the Thorne family empire. Maya moved around the table, handing out glossy printed summaries of the estate distribution to the key family members, letting them marvel at the sheer scale of Julian's new fortune. She slid a copy across the polished mahogany table toward me, stopping it right in front of my hands. "Read it and weep," Maya whispered, leaning down close to my ear. "You get absolutely nothing." I did not look at the cover page. I did not care about the grand proclamations, the flowery legal jargon, or the hidden threats Maya had embedded in the text. I flipped straight to the back of the document, directly to the financial annex and the schedule of corporate assets. This was my territory. This was where the lies always fell apart. My eyes scanned the long columns of corporate entity tags, tax identification numbers, and holding company structures. Julian and Maya were busy accepting handshakes and celebrating their absolute victory, completely ignoring me. They did not notice me tracing the complex web of subsidiary LLCs listed under the Thorne Global Real Estate umbrella. My trained eyes caught the structural pattern almost instantly. The parent company Julian had just so proudly inherited was no longer the primary beneficiary of the real estate revenue. Richard had executed a massive, catastrophic corporate restructuring right under their noses during the last 6 months of his life. The commercial properties were heavily leveraged. The dummy corporations I had seen earlier on my laptop were not just draining cash, they were siphoning all the equity out of the buildings and leaving behind massive toxic liabilities. Richard had taken out enormous high-interest offshore loans using Thorne Global Real Estate as the sole guarantor. He had systematically stripped the value from every single brick he owned and transferred the clean capital straight into the secure banking token he had handed me at dinner. Thorne Global Real Estate was not an empire anymore. It was a hollow, decaying shell entirely propped up by fraudulent collateral and suffocating debt. I looked up from the financial annex and stared directly at Julian. He was raising his glass of scotch, accepting a toast from Uncle Frank, oblivious to the absolute destruction waiting for him. Julian had not just inherited his father's legacy. By legally accepting the position of sole heir and operating director, he had just assumed personal legal liability for a collapsing multi-billion-dollar black hole. And I was the only person in the room who knew he was already bankrupt. I gently closed the thick leather portfolio and left it sitting right there on the polished mahogany table. I did not say a single word to Julian. I did not interrupt his pathetic victory lap. Let him drink his expensive scotch and soak in the adoration of a family that only loved him for his perceived wealth. He had just signed his own financial death warrant, and I was not about to stop him. I pushed my chair back, and the scraping sound barely registered over the loud cheering. I walked out of the dining room, navigated the crowded foyer, and stepped out the heavy front doors into the cool afternoon air. I needed to get back to my hotel and start tracing exactly where Richard had sent the real equity. I was halfway down the sweeping stone driveway, approaching the wrought iron gates, when the sharp clicking of designer heels echoed on the pavement behind me. I did not have to turn around to know who it was. Maya marched up beside me, physically blocking my path to the street. She was clutching a sleek leather folder, her face a mask of absolute corporate hostility. She did not want me to just leave. She wanted to make sure I was completely crushed. I stopped walking and looked at her. The wind whipped her perfectly styled hair, but her eyes remained cold and entirely fixed on me. She opened the folder and pulled out a crisp cashier check along with a stapled legal document. She thrust them toward my chest, forcing me to take them or let them fall to the ground. I grabbed the papers, looking down at the numbers printed on the check. $100,000. It was an insulting number, a tiny fraction of what I was legally owed under my actual updated prenuptial agreement. Take the charity, Chloe Maya commanded, her voice echoing slightly in the empty driveway. That is a severance package for your 4 years of service to this family. Sign the non-disclosure agreement attached to it and walk away forever. You will never speak about Richard, you will never speak about Thorn Global, and you will absolutely never contact my husband again. I looked from the check back up to her face. And if I refuse, I asked, keeping my tone mild and curious. Maya stepped closer, invading my personal space. Her eyes narrowed into predatory slits. Blacklist is a nasty word in the financial sector, she whispered sharply. I have partners at every major law firm and accounting agency on speed dial. I can make sure you never work again. You will be toxic. A gold-digging widow who tried to fleece her dying husband and got thrown out on the street. Take the money. Go find a cheap apartment and pretend you never met us. I looked down at the check again and let out a soft, genuine laugh. I folded the crisp paper in half and then tore it straight down the middle. I tore it again, dropping the shredded pieces onto the pristine driveway right at her feet. Maya's smug expression instantly vanished, replaced by absolute shock. She was so entirely used to bullying people into submission that my defiant rejection completely short-circuited her brain. As she raised her hand to point a threatening finger at me, the afternoon sun caught the heavy platinum and diamond watch wrapped tightly around her wrist. It was a custom Audemars Piguet, easily worth $250,000. I had seen her wearing a basic Rolex just 2 days ago. She was spending cash she thought she had just secured. Buying jewelry to hide a margin call, Maya? I asked, tilting my head slightly. The SEC usually frowns on that. She froze. Her hand dropped slowly back to her side. All the color instantly drained from her face, leaving her perfectly applied makeup looking like a mask painted on a corpse. What did you just say? She demanded, her voice losing its sharp edge. I stepped forward, closing the distance between us until I was looking directly into her eyes. I saw the schedule of assets you just handed over to Julian. I saw the dummy corporations listed under the parent umbrella. Did you really think you could hide heavily leveraged offshore debt from a certified forensic auditor? I know Thorn Global is severely overextended. I know the commercial properties are underwater. And I know you and Julian have been desperately moving equity around to cover massive margin calls before the bank seized the entire portfolio. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The brilliant corporate attorney was completely speechless. Julian does not know how bad it actually is, does he? I continued, keeping my voice low and lethal. He thinks he just inherited an empire. He does not realize he just inherited a graveyard of toxic debt. You set him up to take the fall while you buy diamond watches. Enjoy the empty crown, Maya. I turned my back on her and walked through the heavy gates, stepping into the waiting cab I had ordered. I did not look back to see her reaction. I knew I had struck a nerve so deep it would keep her awake for weeks. I leaned against the back seat of the cab, watching the city streets roll by. I had $43 million secured in a Swiss account that she could never touch. But the look of sheer terror on her face when I mentioned the margin calls confirmed my worst suspicions. Richard had not just hidden the money to protect me. He had hidden it because Maya and Julian were running a massive illegal financial scheme right under his nose, and they had ruined the family business to do it. The cab pulled up to my downtown hotel. I paid the driver in cash and walked through the busy lobby, heading straight for the elevators. I needed to get my laptop and start pulling the historical trading data on Thorn Global before Maya figured out how to lock me out of the server archives. The elevator doors opened on my floor, and I walked down the quiet carpeted hallway toward my suite. As I approached my room, I stopped dead in my tracks. The heavy wooden door was cracked open about 2 inches. The electronic deadbolt was completely splintered, the metal casing hanging off the door frame. My heart slammed against my ribs. I pushed the door open slowly, holding my breath. The suite had been completely ransacked. The mattress was flipped off the box spring and slashed open. The drawers from the dresser were pulled out and thrown across the room. My leather tote bag was sliced apart, its contents scattered across the carpet. My spare clothes were ripped from their hangers and dumped in the corner. They had torn the entire room to shreds, looking for something specific. They were not looking for cash or jewelry. They were looking for the black secure banking token Richard had given me, and they were willing to destroy absolutely anything in their path to find it. I did not step a single foot inside that room. My pulse hammered in my ears, but my mind instantly shifted into absolute survival mode. If they had located my hotel room this quickly, they were not just making lucky guesses or paying off the concierge. They were actively tracking me. I pulled my standard cell phone from my jacket pocket, staring at the sleek glass screen. Maya had used Marcus to freeze my bank accounts, which meant she had direct legal access to my primary financial data. With a simple subpoena or a well-placed bribe to a telecommunications provider, it would take one of her junior tech associates exactly 3 minutes to ping the GPS locator on my registered smartphone. I dropped the expensive device into a tall metal trash can near the elevator without a second thought. I turned around and walked straight back the way I came. I had only the clothes on my back, the remaining cash I had withdrawn earlier, and the heavy leather tote bag containing my forensic laptop and Richard's secure banking token. I exited the hotel through the concrete service corridors in the basement, completely avoiding the high-definition security cameras in the main lobby. I walked for 2 miles through the bustling downtown streets, deliberately weaving through crowded outdoor markets and busy subway stations to ensure I had absolutely no tail. I found a dusty discount electronics store on the gritty edge of the industrial district and purchased a cheap refurbished laptop with the cash I had left. 2 blocks later, I bought another prepaid burner phone, paying the cashier with small bills. I needed to vanish completely from Maya's radar. I hailed a passing taxi and gave the driver an address for a rundown cash-only motel on the far outskirts of the city. The motel room smelled strongly of stale cigarette smoke and cheap industrial bleach. The floral bedspread was faded to a dull gray, and the broken neon sign outside flickered relentlessly, casting a harsh red glare through the thin curtains. It was a massive downgrade from the Beacon Hill estate, but it was entirely off the grid. I sat at the wobbly laminate desk and booted up the refurbished laptop. I connected to the motel's unsecured internet through a triple-layered virtual private network, bouncing my IP address across servers in Iceland, Tokyo, and Brazil. Once my digital footprint was completely masked, I created a ghost workstation. I needed to get back into the Thorn Global real estate servers, but Maya would definitely have their IT department monitoring the main administrative portals for my original login credentials. I did not need my official credentials, I just needed the structural vulnerability I had discovered exactly 3 years ago. Shortly after Richard and I were married, I ran a comprehensive security audit on the company's internal network just to familiarize myself with his business operations. I found a massive glaring loophole in their legacy database architecture. It allowed anyone with a specific backdoor terminal path to bypass the primary firewall and access the deepest financial ledgers without leaving a single digital signature. I had brought the printed report directly to Julian during a quarterly board meeting. He had tossed my carefully documented file across the conference table without even opening it. He laughed loudly in front of the entire executive team, telling me that a woman who spent her days picking out floral arrangements and planning charity galas had no business lecturing a seasoned executive about digital security architecture. He told me to leave the complex technical issues to the men who actually understood them. His sheer arrogant sexism had prevented him from patching the very hole I was now walking right through. My fingers flew across the cheap plastic keyboard, writing the specific command lines required to exploit that exact vulnerability. The screen flickered black for a fraction of a second before flooding with cascading rows of raw green data. I was inside the Thorn Global mainframe, undetected and entirely invisible. I bypassed the standard operating accounts. I already knew they were empty. I needed to see what Maya and Julian were doing to cover up the massive debt Richard had saddled them with. They were hemorrhaging cash, and the margin calls I had mentioned to Maya were looming over their heads like a guillotine. People like Maya did not just accept defeat when the banks came calling. They stole from somewhere else to plug the holes. I ran a cross-referenced query looking for unauthorized outbound wire transfers executed within the last 48 hours. I set the parameter to flag any movement over $10 million. The system churned loudly, processing millions of data points across the vast subsidiary network. If Maya was desperately trying to stop the banks from seizing the commercial properties, she would need a massive influx of liquid capital immediately. But where would she get it when the corporate accounts were already drained dry? The progress bar reached 100% and chimed softly. A single high-priority file appeared on my screen. I opened the encrypted ledger and stared at the numbers. The sheer scale of the theft made my stomach physically churn. Maya had executed a manual override wire transfer late last night while the rest of the family was mourning. She moved $68 million out of the company, but she did not take it from a corporate holding account or a real estate escrow. She took it directly from the Thorn Global Employee Pension Fund. She had completely wiped out the retirement savings of over 2,000 hardworking employees who had dedicated their lives to building Richard's company. It was a catastrophic federal crime that would ruin thousands of innocent families. I traced the destination of the stolen pension funds. The money had not gone to pay off the commercial debt like I originally assumed. It had bypassed the corporate creditors entirely. The $68 million was wired to a private offshore shell corporation registered in the Cayman Islands. I ran a quick cross-check on the shell entity, pulling the international corporate registry documents through a separate backdoor channel. The primary beneficial owner of the offshore account was not Julian Thorn. It was Maya. She was not trying to save his real estate empire at all. She was stealing the employee pension fund to finance her own permanent escape. I sat in the dim light of the cheap motel room, staring at the glowing screen of the refurbished laptop. The offshore routing numbers confirming Maya's theft of the $68 million employee pension fund burned themselves into my memory. She was completely liquidating the future of thousands of hardworking people to build her own golden parachute. I rapidly downloaded the entire encrypted ledger onto a secure flash drive, yanking it from the USB port, just as my newly purchased burner phone vibrated violently against the laminate desk. I unlocked the screen and found a flurry of notifications flooding my newsfeed. Maya and Julian had not wasted a single second. If they could not find the banking token, they were going to systematically destroy my credibility so that no one would ever believe a word I said. A major financial blog known for its vicious corporate takedowns had just published a massive exclusive exposé. The headline glared at me in bold black letters, calling me the Black Widow of Thorn Global. I scrolled through the digital article, feeling a cold knot form in my stomach. Maya had orchestrated a masterful smear campaign. She and Julian had provided the blog with heavily doctored emails and selectively edited financial statements. The article accused me of elder abuse, claiming I had spent the last year manipulating a dying man into signing away his corporate assets. They painted me as a ruthless gold digger who had systematically locked Richard's own children out of his life while secretly siphoning funds into hidden accounts. I needed to clear my head and formulate a counteroffensive. The walls of the motel room were closing in on me, reeking of stale smoke and bleach. I grabbed my heavy black coat, slipped the encrypted flash drive into my inner pocket, and stepped out into the freezing afternoon air to walk to the convenience store across the cracked asphalt parking lot. I barely made it past the rusted ice machine when a sleek black news van suddenly screeched to a halt right in front of me, blocking my path entirely. The side door slid open with a violent crash. A cameraman jumped out hoisting a massive lens onto his shoulder. A woman in a sharp trench coat shoved a microphone directly into my face, the bright red logo of a local news station flashing aggressively. Chloe Thorne, the reporter, shouted, her voice piercing the quiet parking lot. Maya Thorne has just released a public statement regarding the missing corporate funds. She claims you isolated Richard from his loving family for 6 months. Care to comment on the allegations of elder abuse? I stepped back, holding my hand up to block the blinding glare of the camera light. They had tracked me. Maya had leaked my location to the press to ensure my humiliation was broadcast in high definition. Maya Thorne says you refused to let Julian see his father on his deathbed. The reporter pressed, stepping aggressively into my personal space. She stated on the record that you manipulated a heavily medicated man into altering his financial legacy. Did you steal the missing millions, Chloe? Where are the Thorne corporate assets? I stared directly into the camera lens, refusing to flinch or show a single ounce of fear. I remembered those final 6 months perfectly. I remembered Richard begging me to keep his greedy son and ruthless daughter-in-law out of his bedroom because every time they visited, they only asked about the real estate portfolio. I remembered standing between a dying man and the family who only saw him as a walking bank account. But I could not say any of that now. If I defended myself on camera, I would look exactly like the desperate defensive criminal Maya wanted me to be. I clamped my mouth shut, lowered my head, and pushed aggressively past the reporter. "Are you fleeing the state?" "Chloe," the reporter yelled, chasing me across the wet pavement. "Maya Thorne says she will not rest until you are behind bars." I reached the door of my motel room, swiped the magnetic keycard, and slammed the heavy door shut, engaging the deadbolt and the security chain. The reporter banged on the wood twice before finally giving up and retreating to her van. I stood in the center of the dark room, listening to the violent pounding of my own heart. Maya wanted me to panic. She wanted me to hire an expensive defense attorney and drain my resources fighting a public relations war I could never win. She was using the media as a weapon of mass distraction to keep everyone looking at me, while she quietly transferred the stolen pension funds into her Cayman Islands account. I walked over to the desk and opened the laptop. I was done playing defense. If Maya wanted to use Richard's money and Richard's name to destroy me, I was going to strip her of the one thing she valued more than anything else: her status. Julian and Maya had officially moved into Richard's primary Beacon Hill estate that very morning, claiming the massive historic property as their new royal palace. They were hosting a victory dinner there tonight, inviting the city's elite to celebrate their hostile takeover of Thorne Global. I logged into the secure portal of my Zurich Wealth Management account. I bypassed the standard interface and initiated a direct encrypted chat protocol with my private Swiss asset manager. I knew from my years of auditing Richard's personal finances that the Beacon Hill estate was not owned outright. Richard had heavily leveraged the mansion against a boutique private equity firm in New York to fund a failed commercial development 3 years ago. Julian and Maya assumed the estate was free and clear because Richard had hidden the private mortgage documents from the family trust. I typed my instructions rapidly into the secure chat terminal, authorizing a highly aggressive financial maneuver. I instructed my asset manager to create an anonymous shell holding company Delaware registered and entirely untraceable. Using a fraction of the $43 million Richard had given me, I ordered the immediate silent buyout of the Beacon Hill Estate's entire debt portfolio from the New York equity firm. The transaction took less than 10 minutes to clear. The New York firm was thrilled to offload the high-interest debt, and they transferred the complete deed of trust directly to my anonymous shell company. I closed the laptop and leaned back in the cheap motel chair, a slow, cold smile spreading across my face. Maya was busy feeding lies to the press and buying expensive diamond watches. Julian was busy pouring expensive scotch for his society friends in the grand foyer of a mansion he thought he owned. They had absolutely no idea that I had just purchased their mortgage. I was no longer the disgraced widow hiding in a cheap motel. I was their landlord, and I was going to evict them. My moment of quiet triumph was violently interrupted by a thunderous pounding on the motel room door. The flimsy wooden frame rattled on its hinges. I instinctively closed the refurbished laptop, sliding the encrypted flash drive deep into my pocket. The pounding came again louder this time, accompanied by a sharp, authoritative voice demanding I open up immediately. I stood up, keeping my breathing steady, and walked toward the door. I peered through the scratched peephole. Standing on the exterior walkway, illuminated by the buzzing red neon light, were two plainclothes detectives flashing gold badges. And standing right behind them, wearing a tailored cashmere coat and an expression of absolute predatory glee, was Maya. She had used her extensive network within the local police department to track my new burner phone connection. She was not just trying to ruin my reputation in the press anymore. She was trying to put me in a federal prison. I safely downloaded the offshore routing numbers and the Cayman Islands corporate registry documents onto a heavily encrypted flash drive before wiping the refurbished laptop completely clean. Maya was building a massive golden parachute, preparing to abandon her husband and flee the country the moment Thorn Global inevitably collapsed. But Julian was entirely oblivious to his wife's imminent exit strategy. He genuinely believed the fabricated balance sheets and thought he was the undisputed billionaire king of the city's real estate market. Over the next 48 hours, Julian went on a catastrophic and highly public spending spree to broadcast his inherited wealth. He started buying up luxury commercial real estate across the financial district at absurdly inflated prices, paying zero attention to the underlying analytics or projected revenue returns. He just wanted his name on the biggest buildings in the city. Maya was absolutely furious with his recklessness. Every time Julian made a massive high-profile purchase, she had to scramble behind the scenes, frantically borrowing against their already over-leveraged assets just to cover his checks and maintain the illusion of their solvency. She was plugging holes in a sinking ship while Julian kept drilling new ones just to show off. It was the perfect psychological vulnerability, and I knew exactly how to use his massive ego to completely drain their remaining liquidity. On Thursday morning, the city hosted a highly exclusive public real estate auction in the grand ballroom of the Omni Hotel. The crown jewel of the event was the Sterling Building, a historic downtown high-rise that Richard Thorne had coveted for decades but never managed to acquire. Julian announced to the local financial press that he would be placing the winning bid to secure his father's legacy. He wanted the front-page headline, and he wanted the room full of elite developers to watch him take the throne. I walked into the crowded ballroom wearing an oversized dark coat, a wide-brimmed hat, and heavy black sunglasses that hid my features perfectly. I slipped into a velvet chair in the very back row, completely unnoticed by the flashing cameras and the wealthy investors mingling near the front. Julian and Maya sat in the front row, VIP section. Julian looked incredibly smug, wearing a bespoke designer suit and leaning back in his chair with absolute arrogant confidence. Maya sat rigidly beside him, looking physically ill. She kept checking her phone, her perfectly manicured fingers tapping anxiously against her leather purse. She knew they did not have the liquid cash for this kind of theatrical display, but she could not stop Julian without exposing her own massive theft of the pension funds. I was not there to bid under my own name. Sitting 3 rows ahead of me was Arthur Vance, a seasoned corporate proxy buyer I had hired that morning, using a tiny fraction of my shielded Swiss funds. Arthur was instructed to follow my digital cues explicitly and never break his professional composure. The auctioneer took the podium, adjusting his microphone as a hush fell over the grand ballroom. The bidding for the Sterling Building commenced at a starting price of $50 million. Julian immediately raised his paddle, offering $55 million. He looked around the room, daring anyone to challenge the new operating director of Thorn Global. A rival commercial developer offered $60 million. Julian instantly countered with 65. I tapped the screen of my burner phone, sending a silent, encrypted signal. Arthur raised his paddle. $70 million. Julian scoffed loudly, adjusting his silk tie and raising his paddle again. 75. I tapped the screen again. Arthur casually raised his paddle. $80 million. Maya grabbed Julian's arm, leaning in to whisper frantically in his ear. I could see the sheer panic radiating from her tense posture. She knew $80 million would instantly trigger a margin call on their remaining collateral. She knew a bid that high would drain every single drop of liquidity they had left and expose their massive insolvency to the entire city. She begged him to lower his paddle, but Julian yanked his arm away, his face flushing with furious, arrogant anger. He was not about to lose the ultimate prize to an anonymous proxy in front of the local media and his elite peers. He hated being told what to do, and he absolutely refused to look weak. 85 million, Julian shouted, his voice booming through the silent ballroom. The crowd murmured in shock. The building was realistically only worth 60 million on its best day. Julian was bidding strictly on pure, unadulterated ego. I smiled beneath my dark sunglasses and tapped my screen one final time. 95 million? Arthur called out, his voice perfectly calm and completely steady. Maya practically dug her nails into Julian's sleeve, her face turning the color of wet ash. She was hyperventilating, visibly trembling, as she realized the financial cliff they were standing on. But Julian was completely blind to reality. He stood up from his chair, shaking off his wife's grip, and pointed his paddle directly at Arthur. $110 million, Julian roared. The entire ballroom erupted into loud gasps and scattered applause. Arthur lowered his paddle and remained totally silent. I slipped my burner phone back into my pocket. The trap had been perfectly set and Julian had walked right into it. Sold for $110 million to Julian Thorne, the auctioneer announced, striking his heavy wooden gavel against the podium. Julian threw his arms up in victory, turning to the flashing cameras with a triumphant grin. Maya sat frozen in her chair, looking like a woman waiting for her execution. Mr. Thorne, the auctioneer, continued over the fading applause. Per our strict auction guidelines, we require the immediate transfer of the 10% earnest deposit. $11 million cleared via wire transfer before you leave the building today. Our banking representatives are waiting for you at the front desk. Julian confidently buttoned his expensive jacket and strutted over to the bank of laptops manned by the auction officials. He handed over the Thorne Global corporate banking credentials with a highly theatrical flourish. Maya trailed slowly behind him, dragging her feet and staring blankly at the floor. The bank representative typed the corporate routing numbers into his secure terminal. The ballroom remained respectfully quiet, waiting for the massive transaction to clear. I stood up from my seat in the back row and walked slowly toward the exit, pausing just inside the heavy mahogany doors to watch the inevitable destruction. The bank representative frowned. He typed the numbers again. He picked up a desk phone, dialing a direct line to the financial institution. Julian tapped his fingers impatiently against the table, loudly complaining about the slow processing speed. I am sorry, Mr. Thorne, the representative said, his voice carrying clearly across the quiet room. The wire transfer has been declined. Julian laughed, dismissing the man with an arrogant wave of his hand. That is impossible. It is a corporate security flag because of the high dollar amount. Run it again and stop wasting my time. I just spoke directly with the Institutional Authorization Department, sir, the representative replied, his tone dropping an octave. Your corporate accounts are completely overdrawn. Your institutional lines of credit are frozen. You do not have $11 million available. Your transaction has bounced. The silence in the grand ballroom was absolutely deafening. Every camera, every reporter, and every rival developer stared directly at Julian Thorne. The man who had just claimed to be the undisputed billionaire king of the city's real estate market was standing at the podium, unable to clear a standard deposit. His face flushed a deep, violent shade of crimson as the public humiliation crashed over him. Maya did not look at the failed transaction screen. She slowly turned around, scanning the crowded room with wide, terrified eyes. She bypassed the reporters and the laughing developers. Her gaze swept over the rows of chairs until she locked onto my disguised figure standing quietly in the doorway. She realized in that exact terrifying moment that the anonymous proxy was not a rival firm. It was a deliberate, calculated execution. She realized someone was actively manipulating the market to bleed them dry and expose their fraud to the entire world. I pulled down my dark sunglasses, letting her see my eyes for one brief second before I turned and walked out into the busy street. The icy wind off the harbor felt fantastic against my face as I blended into the crowded sidewalks of the financial district. I did not run. I walked with the measured pace of someone who had just detonated a bomb and was casually strolling away from the blast radius. I hailed a passing taxi and handed the driver a fistful of cash, instructing him to take me to a rented anonymous co-working space on the industrial edge of the city. I needed stable high-speed internet to watch the fallout unfold in real time. By the time I secured a private glass-walled booth and booted up my ghost workstation, Julian's massive public humiliation was already trending across every local news network and financial forum. But I was not interested in the public circus or the talking heads mocking his failure. I wanted to see the private panic. I engaged my backdoor access into the Thorn Global administrative servers, bypassing the secondary firewalls and tapping directly into Maya and Julian's executive communication channels. The internal network was lighting up like a Christmas tree. Julian was having a complete, spectacular meltdown. He was sending frantic, encrypted messages to his personal bankers, his private wealth managers, and his board of directors, demanding emergency bridge loans, expedited lines of credit, and immediate liquid cash to cover the bounced deposit. Every single request he sent was met with a polite but incredibly firm denial. His credit was completely toxic, and the institutional lenders were terrified of the sudden insolvency. Maya stepped in exactly as I knew she would. I intercepted a highly sensitive audio file sent directly from her private encrypted device to Julian's phone. I hit play and listened to her sharp, venomous voice echoing through my headphones. "Stop panicking like a pathetic child," Maya hissed on the recording, her tone dripping with absolute revulsion. "You embarrassed us today, Julian. You let your massive ego hijack your brain, and now we are bleeding in front of the entire city. I told you to lower your paddle, but you never listen. I am the one who has to clean up your reckless messes. I am the one who secured our safety net while you were playing billionaire. We will pull the $11 million from the offshore Cayman accounts to cover your bounced deposit and save face with the auction board. You will stay quietly in the mansion, keep your mouth shut, and let me handle the adults." The audio clipped off, leaving a heavy, ringing silence in my ears. The brilliant golden boy of the Thorn Empire was nothing but a fragile puppet. Maya had been holding his strings the entire time, treating him with absolute disdain, while secretly funneling his inheritance into her own offshore paradise. She was perfectly willing to use a fraction of the stolen employee pension funds to patch his bruised ego and maintain their illusion of wealth, but she made sure he knew exactly who was in charge. It was not a marriage, it was a hostile takeover from the inside. But Maya had a massive blind spot. She controlled the corporate accounts, and she held the keys to the stolen pension funds, but she did not know the full extent of Julian's personal depravity. I opened a separate terminal and began digging through Julian's private encrypted ledgers, the ones he kept hidden behind multiple proxy servers even from his wife. Julian loved the illusion of legitimate wealth, but he loved high-stakes underground gambling even more. Over the past 2 years, he had accumulated staggering personal debts to a syndicate of unregulated private lenders operating out of high-end cigar lounges and backroom poker clubs. These were not bankers in expensive suits who sent polite denial letters on watermarked stationery. These were dangerous men who operated entirely outside the law and collected their debts with absolute brutality. Julian owed them nearly $4 million in cash. He had been stalling them for months, promising a massive, unrecorded payout the moment he officially took control of his father's estate. Now that his corporate accounts were frozen, his public credit was destroyed, and his face was plastered across the news as a financial fraud, he had absolutely no way to pay them back. And Maya would never authorize the release of her stolen offshore funds to cover his illicit gambling debts. It was the perfect leverage. I created a completely untraceable email address routing the IP through a series of randomized international servers to ensure my location remained completely hidden. I drafted a concise anonymous message addressed directly to the primary contact of the lending syndicate. I attached the internal banking alerts showing Julian's bounced auction check, the frozen corporate accounts, and the foreclosure notices currently pending on his commercial properties. I added a single line of text at the very bottom of the email. Julian Thorne is entirely insolvent and his wife is preparing to flee the country with his remaining liquid assets. Collect your debts today, or you will never see a single dime. I hit send and watched the progress bar turn green. I immediately switched my screen to the external security cameras of the Beacon Hill estate. Maya and Julian had just arrived home from the disastrous auction, pulling their luxury SUV into the circular driveway. The heavy iron gates closed slowly behind them, securing the perimeter. I watched as they walked up the grand stone steps, arguing violently, their arms waving in the fading evening light. But their argument was about to be permanently interrupted. Less than 20 minutes after I sent the anonymous email, 3 unmarked black SUVs rolled slowly up the private street. They parked aggressively across the driveway, blocking the iron gates entirely. 6 large men stepped out of the vehicles wearing heavy leather jackets and moving with terrifying, deliberate purpose. They did not push the buzzer. They did not wait for an invitation. One of the men pulled a heavy metal crowbar from his jacket and smashed the electronic keypad to pieces, rendering the security gate completely useless. They pushed the heavy iron doors open and marched straight up the stone pathway toward the front door. Julian thought he was playing a high-stakes game with his father's money. He was about to learn the brutal reality of owing people who did not play by the rules. The heavy brass knocker on the front door did not even have a chance to fall before the lead collector kicked the custom mahogany violently inward. The wood splintered with a deafening crack. Julian was standing in the grand foyer, pouring himself a stiff drink to calm his shattered nerves from the auction disaster. He dropped the crystal decanter the moment the 6 men flooded into his house. The amber liquid shattered across the imported marble floor. The lead collector, a man whose face was a map of jagged scars, grabbed Julian by the lapels of his expensive, bespoke suit and slammed him brutally against the silk wallpaper. Julian screamed, pleading for time, begging them to understand that his corporate accounts were just temporarily frozen. Maya stood at the top of the grand sweeping staircase, clutching the marble banister and watching her husband sob like a terrified child. She did not run down to help him. She did not reach for her phone to call the police. She knew exactly what kind of men these were, and she knew that calling the authorities would only invite federal regulators to pry into their lives. She turned her back on her husband's. Screams walked silently down the back servants' hallway and slipped out the side door into the freezing night. Julian was officially a radioactive liability. It was time for her to save herself. Maya drove straight to the Thorne Global corporate headquarters, pushing her luxury sedan well over the speed limit. She was highly intelligent, and she knew the clock was rapidly ticking down to 0. Julian's spectacular public default at the real estate auction was going to trigger immediate massive alarm bells across the financial sector. By Monday morning, the Securities and Exchange Commission would be knocking on the glass doors of Thorne Global, with federal warrants demanding a full review of their liquidity. If the SEC looked at the main ledger, they would immediately notice the $68 million completely missing from the employee pension fund. Maya needed to launder the digital paper trail, and she needed to do it before the sun came up. She marched into the executive suite and immediately contacted Apex Financial Forensics. Apex was an elite, highly aggressive auditing firm known for making inconvenient corporate discrepancies quietly vanish. They were expensive, ruthless, and completely discreet. Maya authorized a massive emergency retainer fee, demanding their top crisis team arrive at the building within the hour. She planned to pay them to scrub the servers, bury the pension deficit under layers of fabricated clerical errors, and generate a clean bill of health to hand to the federal regulators. I was watching every single one of her frantic moves from my anonymous ghost workstation in the rented industrial office. I had maintained my backdoor access into the Thorne Global Administrative Network, and I could see the emergency contracts she was desperately signing. But Maya had a massive glaring blind spot. She assumed that money could buy absolute loyalty, and she completely underestimated my own professional network. When I saw the digital authorization designating Marcus Vance as the lead forensic auditor for the Apex Crisis team, I actually laughed out loud in the empty co-working booth. Marcus and I had worked together 5 years ago during a massive corporate security overhaul in Chicago. He was a brilliant, relentless data analyst with zero tolerance for corporate corruption. He knew exactly how sharp my technical skills were, and we maintained a quiet, mutual professional respect. I did not wait for Marcus to arrive at the Thorn Global building. I immediately drafted a highly secure, encrypted message to his private terminal. I bypassed the standard greetings and attached the raw, unredacted digital ledgers I had pulled from Richard's encrypted hard drive at the motel. I included the specific backdoor terminal paths, the offshore routing numbers, and the exact timestamps of Maya's illegal wire transfers. I simply typed one sentence below the massive data drop. Do not let her hand you the sanitized books, Marcus. Look at the shadows. When Marcus Vance walked into the Thorn Global boardroom at 2 in the morning, Maya played her role flawlessly. She was the stressed, exhausted executive simply trying to clean up her late husband's messy accounting system. She offered Marcus a polite smile, a cup of expensive coffee, and a stack of heavily doctored financial reports that completely masked the stolen pension funds. She promised him a monumental personal bonus if the audit could be expedited and closed by the weekend. Marcus accepted the coffee, nodded professionally, and sat down at the head of the long glass table. He did not touch her fabricated reports. He simply opened his laptop, connected to the mainframe, and spent the next 6 hours cross-referencing her sanitized documents with the raw, unredacted ledgers I had silently provided him. The sun was just beginning to rise over the city skyline, casting a harsh, bright light through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the executive boardroom. Maya sat across from Marcus, tapping her manicured nails impatiently against the glass. She was exhausted but confident, assuming her expensive fixers had done exactly what she paid them to do. Are the compliance reports ready to be filed? Maya asked, checking her diamond watch. We need to be prepared for the SEC inquiries on Monday. I expect your firm to stand fully behind the integrity of these accounts. Marcus slowly closed his laptop. He did not smile. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick red folder, sliding it deliberately across the long glass table until it stopped directly in front of her. We cannot file a clean compliance report, Mrs. Thorne, Marcus stated, his voice perfectly calm and devoid of any emotion. I am legally obligated as an officer of this auditing firm to submit this specific file directly to the federal authorities. Maya's confident posture instantly vanished. Her hand froze over the red folder. What are you talking about? She demanded, her voice sharp and defensive. I paid your firm to streamline the accounting errors. There is nothing in those books that cannot be reallocated. You are correct that the $68 million missing from the employee pension fund was not a clerical error, Marcus replied, leaning forward, resting his hands on the table. But my forensic analysis went much deeper than the parameters you provided. You did not just empty the pension fund, Mrs. Thorne. You have been systematically bleeding this entire corporation dry for the last 12 months. We are looking at a total catastrophic deficit of $200 million. Maya's breath hitched loudly in her throat. She stared at Marcus, her eyes wide and entirely uncomprehending. But the true horror was yet to come. The worst part, Mrs. Thorne, Marcus continued, his voice dropping to a chillingly quiet register, is the digital footprint. Whoever executed these massive offshore wire transfers was incredibly sloppy. The IP address logs for every single unauthorized transaction, covering the entire $200 million theft point, directly to your personal devices. Your phone, your home office terminal, and your private executive laptop. The federal indictment is going to have your name written all over it. Maya stared at the red folder, the color draining from her meticulously contoured face. Marcus did not blink. He packed up his laptop, leaving the damning evidence on the glass table, and walked out of the Thorn Global boardroom without another word. Maya was trapped. The walls were closing in rapidly, and the federal regulators would be tearing through her life by Monday morning. But Maya Thorne did not surrender. She calculated. If the Securities and Exchange Commission was coming, she needed a distraction massive enough to blind the entire financial district. She needed the illusion of absolute, unshakable prosperity to buy herself enough time to execute her escape plan. November was drawing to a close, which meant the annual Thorne Thanksgiving Charity Gala was only days away. Historically, Richard Thorne used the exclusive event to quietly secure backdoor deals with city officials and wealthy developers. Maya and Julian decided to turn the upcoming gala into a spectacular, blinding display of corporate invincibility. They doubled the already astronomical catering budget. They booked an A-list string quartet. Maya hired a ruthless public relations firm to aggressively seed the financial press with fabricated stories boasting about Thorne Global's record-breaking quarterly projections. It was a complete lie designed to calm the panicked investors who had witnessed Julian's disastrous auction default. They needed the city's elite to walk into the Beacon Hill mansion and see a billionaire empire operating at the absolute peak of its power. Julian was completely oblivious to the $200 million crater Maya had dug, just as he was oblivious to the federal indictment hovering directly over his wife's head. He genuinely believed his own press releases. To him, the bounced auction check was nothing more than a minor banking glitch, a temporary embarrassment that the lavish gala would instantly erase. His massive ego demanded a victory lap. He wanted an audience for his triumph, and he specifically wanted to humiliate the one person who knew the truth about his utter incompetence. I was sitting on the edge of the sagging mattress in my cheap roadside motel, finalizing the digital dead ends that would lock Maya out of her offshore accounts permanently, when a sharp, aggressive knock rattled my thin wooden door. A uniformed private courier stood on the cracked concrete walkway, holding a thick cream-colored envelope sealed with the Thorne family crest in heavy gold wax. I signed for the package and tore it open under the flickering motel porch light. Inside was a VIP all-access pass to the Thanksgiving Charity Gala. Clipped to the heavy embossed cardstock was a handwritten note from Julian. The ink was pressed deep into the paper, showcasing his arrogant, aggressive scrawl. I heard you are living in a dirty motel now. Come get a hot meal, beggar. Watch how the real Thorne legacy operates. I stared at the note, feeling a cold, sharp smile spread across my face. He could never resist kicking me when he thought I was down. It was the exact same toxic dynamic from our childhood. Whenever our father praised my academic achievements or my quiet dedication, Julian would deliberately destroy my school projects and then throw a $20 bill at my feet just to remind me who held the financial power in the house. He needed me at the gala. He needed the discarded, illegitimate sister to stand in the corner in cheap clothes and watch him play the reigning king of Boston real estate. He wanted to parade his stolen wealth right in front of my face and prove that he had won the ultimate prize. He wanted a grand theatrical show. I was going to give him an absolute masterpiece. I packed up my ghost terminal, wiped the local drives completely clean, and left the motel for the afternoon. I took a secure black car straight to Newbury Street, walking into the most exclusive private evening wear boutique in the city. It was the kind of elite establishment that required a six-figure proof of funds just to schedule a basic fitting. I did not look like their typical clientele in my dark, oversized coat and heavy practical boots. The floor manager immediately moved to intercept me with a polite but dismissive smile, clearly ready to usher me back out onto the street and away from her wealthy patrons. I bypassed her entirely, pulling out the solid black titanium card linked to my heavily shielded Swiss accounts and dropped it firmly on the pristine glass display counter. I demanded their lead designer and their absolute best structural tailor. The floor manager's eyes widened as she recognized the limitless weight of the card. Her dismissive attitude vanished instantly, replaced by frantic, obsequious service. Over the next 4 hours, I was pinned, measured, and draped in the most exquisite fabrics I had ever touched. I bypassed the safe traditional colors and selected a custom-tailored floor-length gown in a shade of deep, venomous crimson. It was a dress designed to command an entire room the second the wearer walked through the heavy wooden doors. It was armor woven from pure silk and sharp architectural angles with a plunging neckline and a dramatic sweeping train. The tailor worked frantically, bringing in 2 assistants and charging triple the standard rush fee to ensure the garment fit my body with lethal perfection. Julian expected a broken, defeated outcast to show up at his back door begging for scraps. He expected me to cower in the shadows, feeling small and insignificant, while he toasted to his fabricated empire and his stolen inheritance. I swiped the black card for the final exorbitant fitting fee and walked out onto the busy street with the heavy garment bag slung over my shoulder. The cold wind whipped my hair, but I felt absolutely nothing but burning anticipation. I was not going to the Thorn Thanksgiving charity gala to get a hot meal. I was going to walk through the front doors of that mansion, look my arrogant brother dead in the eyes, and burn his entire empire to the ground. I carried the heavy garment bag out of the boutique and stepped into the waiting town car. The crimson silk weighed nothing, but it felt like the heaviest armor I had ever worn. The city blurred past the tinted windows as I directed the driver to a secure, short-term luxury rental I had acquired under a corporate alias. The cheap roadside motel had served its purpose, keeping me entirely off the grid while I dismantled my brother's life, but I needed a pristine, controlled environment to finalize the execution. I needed space to lay out the destruction. Once inside the secure penthouse, I laid out the final pieces of the puzzle across the massive granite dining table. This was no longer just about Julian humiliating me with a mocking VIP ticket, or Maya trying to steal a company. It was about absolute total eradication. I booted up my primary terminal and began assembling the master file. I organized the offshore routing numbers tracing Maya's $200 million theft directly back to her personal IP address. I cross-referenced the drained employee pension funds with the desperate unregulated bridge loans she had attempted to secure to cover Julian's staggering gambling debts. Then I pulled up the final devastating piece of evidence I had extracted from Richard's encrypted hard drive. It was a digital copy of his original authentic will, the one Maya and Julian had desperately suppressed and forged over to grant Julian total executive control of Thorn Global. Their fabricated document was a sloppy, rushed job compared to the ironclad legal framework Richard had actually built. They had stolen an empire on paper, and I held the match to burn it. I opened a physical leather folder and pulled out a photograph I had kept hidden for years. It was an old picture of Richard Thorn standing in front of his first commercial development. His face was stern, calculating, and completely unreadable. For weeks I had questioned the exact sum he had wired to my shielded Swiss account. $43 million had felt like such an arbitrary random number to leave behind. But looking at the unredacted corporate ledgers, everything suddenly clicked into brutal, agonizing focus. Richard had not picked that number out of thin air. He knew his golden boy was drowning in unregulated debt. He knew Julian had blindly co-signed on every single major corporate asset, leveraging the entire Thorn legacy to feed his underground gambling addiction and fund his extravagant lifestyle. Julian had infected every bank account, every commercial property, and every institutional line of credit with his toxic signature. The $43 million was the exact total of Richard's personal isolated venture capital. It was the only liquid asset he had aggressively kept out of his son's reach. It was the only clean, untainted money left in the entire collapsing empire. Richard knew the ship was going to sink under the weight of Julian's incompetence and Maya's greed, and he handed the only working lifeboat to the daughter he had publicly disowned. I loaded the forged will, the offshore transaction logs, the IP addresses, and the unredacted ledgers onto a heavy encrypted flash drive. I printed hard copies of the most damning financial summaries, ensuring no digital manipulation could be claimed, and sealed them all inside a thick, tamper-evident envelope. I addressed the package blindly to the lead director of the FBI Financial Crimes Division. I did not include a return address. I did not include a written manifesto or a list of demands. The raw data spoke for itself. I handed the sealed envelope to an independent bonded courier with strict instructions to deliver it directly to the federal field office at exactly 9 o'clock on Monday morning. The fuse was officially lit. Maya and Julian had exactly 72 hours of freedom left before the federal agents kicked their doors down. Thanksgiving evening arrived with a bitter, freezing wind blowing off the Atlantic. The Beacon Hill mansion was lit up like a beacon of absolute arrogance. From the street, I could see valets in crisp uniforms rushing to open doors for city politicians, elite developers, and wealthy investors. The driveway was packed with luxury vehicles, and the sound of the hired string quartet drifted out into the freezing night. It was a flawless, blinding illusion of corporate invincibility, designed to convince the city that Thorn Global was thriving. I slipped into the crimson silk gown in the quiet solitude of my penthouse. The fabric clung to my skin, moving like liquid fire as I walked. The sharp architectural cut of the neckline and the sweeping dramatic train made me look like an entirely different person. The invisible discarded sister was gone. I paired the gown with simple diamond drops and a severe, elegant updo. I looked exactly like the kind of ruthless predator Richard Thorne had raised me to be. I stepped out of my luxury town car at the wrought iron gates of the estate. The cold wind caught the crimson silk, making it flare dramatically around my legs as I walked up the driveway. Two private security guards stood at the entrance checking names off an illuminated tablet. They were big, serious men hired to keep the unwanted out and maintain the illusion of exclusivity. The head guard stepped directly into my path, holding up a thick, gloved hand. He looked at my face and then down at his tablet, his expression hardening into professional dismissal. "I am sorry, miss, you are not on the cleared guest list," he said, his voice flat and authoritative. "This is a private, closed event. I will have to ask you to step back and return to your vehicle immediately." I did not step back. I moved inches from his face, invading his personal space with absolute, unflinching confidence. I leaned in close to his ear and lowered my voice to a sharp, quiet whisper. "Tell your boss that the ghost of the $68 million pension fund is standing at the front door. And if you do not step aside right now, I will make sure the federal marshals know exactly which offshore account your hazard pay comes from." The color instantly drained from the security guard's face. He stared at me with wide, terrified eyes before slowly taking a step back and opening the heavy mahogany door. I stepped across the threshold, moving from the bitter, freezing wind into the suffocating warmth of the Thorne family mansion. The heavy mahogany door clicked shut behind me, sealing me inside the belly of the beast. The grand foyer was an explosion of obscene wealth. Crystal chandeliers cast a blinding golden light over imported marble floors, and massive arrangements of white orchids suffocated the air with their heavy perfume. I handed my dark, oversized coat to a stunned valet, revealing the full, devastating impact of the custom crimson silk gown. It clung to my frame like liquid fire, a stark, violent slash of color against the sea of muted conservative tuxedos and pastel designer dresses worn by the Boston elite. As I stood in the entryway of the estate, I took a slow, deep breath and let the reality of what I had set in motion wash over me. Hours earlier, I had compiled every single piece of devastating evidence into one master file. The offshore routing numbers, the forged will, documents the completely drained employee pension funds. I had sealed the hard drives and printed ledgers into an untraceable blind package and handed it to a secure courier bound directly for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The timer was officially ticking down to absolute ruin. Looking around at the lavish displays of stolen wealth surrounding me, I thought back to the old photograph of Richard Thorne I kept hidden in my bag. I stared at his stern, unreadable face for a long time this afternoon, and the final piece of the puzzle had finally snapped into brilliant, crystal-clear focus. I finally understood why he had wired me exactly $43 million. It was not a random number. Julian had leveraged the entire Thorne legacy co-signing on every major corporate asset to fund his unregulated underground gambling debts. Julian had infected the whole empire with his toxic signature. The $43 million was the only liquid asset Richard had aggressively kept out of his son's reach. It was the only money he had not co-signed with Julian. It was the only clean money left in the entire world. He gave me a war chest to burn the infection out, and I was about to execute his final wish. I walked slowly down the central hallway toward the grand ballroom where the main event was being held. My heels clicked rhythmically against the marble, echoing like a steady heartbeat. As I entered the massive ballroom, the live string quartet was playing a lively classical piece, but the music quickly became background noise to the ripple of shock spreading through the crowd. Conversations died mid-sentence. Champagne flutes paused halfway to lips. The city's wealthiest developers, bankers, and politicians turned to stare at the woman in red who had just crashed the most exclusive private gala of the year. I kept my posture perfectly rigid, radiating absolute, unshakable dominance. I spotted Julian immediately. He was standing near the massive stone fireplace holding court with a tight circle of older conservative investor friends. He held a crystal tumbler of expensive scotch, laughing loudly at a joke someone had just made. Then his eyes locked onto mine across the crowded room. For a fraction of a second, I saw genuine raw panic flash across his face. He recognized the threat, but his massive, fragile ego instantly violently rejected the fear. He could not look weak in front of his financial lifelines. He puffed out his chest, took a deliberate sip of his scotch, and turned to the men surrounding him with a sneering, dismissive laugh. "Look at this!" Julian announced, his voice booming loudly enough for the surrounding guests to hear clearly over the music. My dad's mistake came crawling back for a handout. I suppose the trust fund ran dry and the rat-infested motels lost their charm. Do not worry, gentlemen. I will have the kitchen box up some leftover turkey before we throw the beggar back out onto the street. The wealthy investors chuckled nervously, shifting their weight and gripping their drinks. Julian expected me to flush with deep humiliation. He expected me to lower my eyes and shrink away from his cruel public mockery, just like I had done when we were teenagers, and he would deliberately destroy my belongings while laughing at my tears. But I was not the terrified, invisible sister anymore. I did not break eye contact. I simply smiled, a cold, razor-sharp smile that made his forced laughter die completely in his throat. Before Julian could formulate another insult, Maya intercepted me. She materialized from the crowd like a venomous shadow, her face pulled tight with absolute, barely contained fury. She wore a severe black designer gown that made her look like a corporate executioner. She grabbed my arm, her perfectly manicured fingernails digging painfully into my bare skin as she yanked me toward an empty alcove away from the prying eyes of the investors. She leaned in close, her expensive perfume mixing with the sharp metallic scent of her sheer panic. Her voice was a lethal, furious whisper, vibrating with violent intent. "I do not know how you bypassed the front gate, but you have exactly 5 seconds to turn around and walk back out into the gutter before I completely destroy you. Security is going to drag you out by your hair and throw you onto the pavement. You are nothing in this house. You are a ghost. You will not ruin this night for us." I did not flinch. I did not try to pull my arm away from her punishing grip. I simply looked down at her clutching hand and then back up to her terrified, desperate eyes. She was unraveling. The flawless executive facade was cracking under the immense weight of the $200 million theft she was trying so desperately to hide. I knew federal agents were already reviewing the warrants that would end her life of luxury. I knew her entire world was built on a crumbling foundation of forged documents and stolen pension funds. She was a rat trapped on a sinking ship, and she had no idea that I was the one who had just torched the hull. "You are sweating, Maya," I whispered back, my voice perfectly calm and completely devoid of any emotion. "It ruins your makeup." I casually twisted my arm, breaking her grip with a sharp, fluid motion. She stumbled backward, her eyes wide with absolute shock at my physical defiance. I turned my back on her, completely dismissing her existence. A waiter in a crisp white jacket was passing by, carrying a silver tray loaded with crystal flutes of expensive vintage champagne. I reached out and smoothly lifted a glass without breaking my forward stride. The crowd parted for me like the Red Sea. The nervous whispers escalated into a frantic, buzzing hum as I glided directly toward the front of the grand ballroom. Julian had stopped laughing entirely. He stood frozen by the fireplace, his face flushing a deep, violent crimson as he realized I was not leaving. I was taking control. I walked straight up the short wooden steps onto the elevated stage where the string quartet was seated. The musicians slowed their bows, hovering uncertainly over their instruments, as I bypassed them and moved directly toward the center podium. A heavy chrome microphone stood waiting, designed for Julian to deliver his grand triumphant speech about the invincible Thorne legacy. I set my champagne glass down on the wooden podium with a sharp, definitive click. The entire ballroom held its collective breath. Hundreds of the most powerful people in Boston stared up at me, waiting for the inevitable explosion. I leaned forward, gripped the cold metal stand with both hands, and tapped the microphone sharply with my fingernail. The loud, harsh thud echoed through the massive room, silencing the final lingering whispers. I looked directly at Julian and Maya, standing paralyzed in the crowd, and smiled. "Good evening, tenants." The silence that followed my greeting was absolute. The word tenants hung in the chilled air of the grand ballroom like a live wire sparking against dry kindling. For a fraction of a second, nobody moved. The city's elite stood frozen, holding their breath as the sheer weight of my statement settled over the lavish party. Julian was the first to break the paralysis. His arrogant smirk completely melted away, replaced by a look of wild, feral panic. He shoved his way through the tightly packed crowd of wealthy investors, knocking a silver tray of champagne glasses from a startled waiter's hand. The crystal shattered violently against the imported marble floor, sending a spray of expensive vintage alcohol across the shoes of a prominent city alderman. Nobody looked down. Nobody cared about the mess. Every single eye in the room was fixed entirely on the stage. Julian scrambled up the wooden steps, his face flushed a dark, dangerous purple. The veins in his neck were bulging against the collar of his tailored tuxedo. He lunged toward the podium, reaching frantically for the heavy chrome microphone stand, intending to cut the audio and silence me before the damage became permanent. I anticipated the move. I stepped smoothly into his path, blocking his access to the sound system with my body. My hand went into the concealed pocket of my custom crimson silk gown, and I withdrew a thick, folded document printed on heavy official legal stock. I slammed it down onto the podium directly over the microphone base. The loud smack echoed through the speakers. Julian froze. His hand hovered just inches from the mic. His eyes darted from my face down to the document, and I saw the exact moment his brain registered the raised, embossed seal of the Boston Municipal Registry holding firm at the bottom of the page. The string quartet had completely stopped playing, their instruments lowered to their laps. The only sound in the massive, cavernous space was the heavy, ragged breathing of my brother. The powerful investors who had been laughing at his cruel jokes just moments ago were now watching the stage with hawk-like intensity. These were men and women who swam in shark-infested waters for a living. They smelled blood. They recognized a corporate execution when they saw one, and they were witnessing a massacre. I picked up the microphone, pulling it deliberately from the metal stand so my voice would project with absolute clarity to every single corner of the room. "Julian, you told me to leave this house because you inherited it." I began, my tone perfectly measured, carrying the cold, sharp authority he had always pretended to possess. "You threw me out into the street. You sent couriers to mock me in cheap motels. You told me the Thorne legacy belonged exclusively to you, and you demanded that I acknowledge your supreme executive control. But you did not inherit this property, Julian. You inherited the LLC that leases it." I paused, letting the reality of the corporate structuring sink into the minds of the financial elite standing before us. I watched the dawn of realization wash over the faces of the bankers and developers. Richard Thorne had never transferred the physical deed of the Beacon Hill estate to his reckless son. He was a ruthless businessman, but he was not stupid. He had transferred a shell company, a hollow entity responsible for maintaining the residential lease, while the actual property was held safely as collateral by a private holding firm. A firm Julian had aggressively and foolishly leveraged to cover his massive unregulated offshore gambling debts. Julian had blindly signed the paperwork without ever reading the fine print, assuming his father's empire was an endless open vault. "And 3 days ago I bought the mortgage to this estate from your panicked creditors," I announced, my voice ringing out with lethal precision. "I paid cash, Julian." I liquidated the exact sum of clean, untainted venture capital our father left me. It was the only money you had not already infected with your toxic signatures. I am your landlord, and you are severely behind on rent. A collective sharp intake of breath echoed through the ballroom. The wealthy investors gasped, exchanging wide-eyed, horrified glances. The illusion was completely, irrevocably shattered. The record-breaking quarterly projections, the aggressive public relations campaigns, the lavish, expensive catering, it was all instantly exposed as a desperate, pathetic smokescreen. Julian Thorne, the reigning king of Boston real estate, did not even own the house he was standing in. He was a bankrupt fraud, throwing a multi-million-dollar party with money he did not have, while drowning in a sea of toxic debt. Julian stumbled backward, as if I had physically struck him across the face. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. He looked out at the sea of faces, the city officials he had bribed, the developers, he had bullied, the bankers he owed millions to. They were no longer looking at him with respect, deference, or fear. They were looking at a corpse. His empire had evaporated in less than 60 seconds. He looked down at the legal deed resting on the podium, and the remaining color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and sickly under the bright chandelier lights. But the true explosion came from the floor. Maya tore through the stunned crowd, her severe black designer gown swishing violently around her ankles. The cold, calculated executive facade had entirely disintegrated. She was hyperventilating, her eyes wide and manic, as she realized her elaborate offshore escape plan was currently burning to ashes around her. She scrambled up the steps to the stage, her high heels catching on the wood, causing her to stumble hard to her knees before she forcefully dragged herself upright. She lunged for the microphone, her perfectly manicured hands clawing desperately at the air. "This is a fraud," she screamed, her voice cracking with pure hysteria. "It is a fabricated document. We have equitable title under Massachusetts corporate law. You cannot execute a hostile takeover of a residential holding without a 90-day federal notice." She hurled frantic legal jargon into the microphone, desperately trying to confuse the narrative and salvage a shred of authority in front of the panicked investors. But it was entirely useless. Her hands were violently shaking. The microphone trembled in her grip, producing a harsh, screeching feedback loop that made the guests wince and cover their ears. She looked completely unhinged. The brilliant, untouchable Maya Thorne was publicly unraveling, shedding her sleek corporate armor and revealing the terrified, desperate thief underneath. Maya shoved the microphone stand away and pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at my face. Her voice cracked, losing all of its cultivated transatlantic polish and reverting to a shrill, desperate scream. "Do not listen to a word she says," Maya shrieked, turning her wild eyes toward the crowd of investors. "She is a criminal. She is a fraud. She stole $43 million from a dying man. Richard was sick and vulnerable, and she manipulated him on his deathbed to wire her the money. She is a thief, and she belongs in a federal prison." The ballroom fell into a stunned, breathless silence. The heavy velvet curtains seemed to absorb the shocking accusation. Julian, who had been staring blankly at the legal deed on the podium, suddenly snapped out of his catatonic shock. He grasped onto Maya's lie like a drowning man, clutching a life preserver. "Yes?" Julian shouted, his voice echoing off the high frescoed ceiling. He stepped forward, trying to puff out his chest and regain his stolen authority. She drained his personal accounts while he was heavily medicated. She is a bitter, illegitimate parasite trying to steal the Thorne legacy, because my father cut her out of the real will. Security, apprehend her. Call the police right now. I stood perfectly still, letting their frantic accusations ring through the cavernous space. I did not raise my voice, I did not flinch. I simply stepped forward and pulled the microphone back toward me. I looked out at the sea of wealthy investors, powerful city officials, and elite developers. I saw their narrowed, calculating eyes. They were not looking at me with suspicion. They were looking at Maya and Julian with profound, terminal disgust. They knew how corporate money moved, and they knew that $43 million did not just slip away through simple deathbed manipulation. I smiled. It was a slow, cold smile that reached my eyes and completely shattered whatever fragile, desperate hope Julian had just managed to construct. Richard did not give me that money to steal it, Maya. I projected my voice, allowing it to echo cleanly through the massive ballroom speakers. He transferred it to me because he finally looked at the main ledger. He transferred it because he discovered that you and Julian were running a $200 million Ponzi scheme through his company. The collective gasp from the crowd was audible. A prominent city alderman dropped his crystal champagne flute entirely. It shattered against the imported marble floor, but no one even blinked. Maya stumbled backward as if I had driven a physical blade through her chest. I kept my eyes locked on her, watching the absolute terror completely consume her features. You bled the employee pension funds dry, Maya. You set up dummy corporations in the Cayman Islands to cover Julian's staggering underground gambling debts. You forged my father's signature on dozens of unregulated bridge loans. Richard knew exactly what you were doing. He knew his empire was entirely infected by your catastrophic greed. He knew that the moment he died, the entire rotten structure was going to collapse and crush everyone inside it. I turned my heavy gaze to Julian. He was gripping the edge of the stage, looking physically sick. His golden boy facade had completely melted away, leaving nothing but a terrified, pathetic man-child. Our father did not disown me, Julian, I said, my voice dropping to a quiet, lethal register that carried perfectly through the silent room. He chose me. He transferred the only $43 million of clean, untainted money left in his name to my secured offshore accounts. He did it so the Securities and Exchange Commission would not immediately seize it when they finally audited your fraudulent books. He gave me the only clean capital left, so I could buy this mortgage, buy your debt, and stand right here on this stage to watch you face the consequences of your own arrogant stupidity. Julian shook his head frantically, taking another step backward. No, he whispered, his voice breaking. No, that is impossible. Thorn Global is perfectly liquid. Maya told me the accounts were secure. We have the quarterly projections. You have fabricated spreadsheets and a massive mountain of federal wire fraud charges, I corrected him. Maya lied to you, Julian. She has been lying to you for 12 months. She used your blind, idiotic arrogance to drain every single legitimate asset this family ever owned. And when you bounced that check at the real estate auction, she authorized Apex Financial Forensics to scrub the corporate servers to hide her tracks. But she was sloppy. She left digital footprints across every single unauthorized transfer, and those IP logs point directly to her personal executive terminal. Julian slowly turned his head to look at his wife, the profound betrayal registering in his hollow eyes. Maya let out a guttural, animalistic cry. She lunged forward, her hands outstretched, attempting to rip the microphone from the podium and physically silence me. She was shaking violently, completely consumed by cornered desperation. It is a lie, she screamed, spittle flying from her pale lips. She hacked our systems. She planted that evidence. I am the CEO of Thorn Global. You have absolutely no authority here. You have no proof. I stepped aside, letting her grasp the cold metal stand. I did not need the microphone anymore. The absolute destruction of their empire was already complete. The investors were already pulling out their phones quietly but urgently, dialing their wealth managers and their private attorneys. The room was rapidly fracturing. The wealthy elite were scrambling to distance themselves from the radioactive crater that was Thorn Global. They were fleeing a sinking ship. I looked at Maya, who was clutching the microphone stand and hyperventilating. I do not need to prove anything to these people, Maya, I said, my voice carrying easily over the rising, chaotic murmur of the panicked crowd. I already proved it to the authorities. I sent the unredacted ledgers, the offshore routing numbers, and the original authentic will directly to the Financial Crimes Division of the FBI yesterday morning. Julian let out a sharp, strangled gasp. He grabbed his chest, stumbling sideways until he hit the heavy stone fireplace. Maya froze, completely paralyzed. The microphone slipped from her trembling fingers and hit the wooden stage floor with a loud, sharp crack. I slowly raised my hand and pointed toward the heavy mahogany double doors at the back of the grand ballroom. You do not have to worry about security dragging me out, Julian, I said, my eyes fixed on the main entrance. You have much bigger problems to deal with. Right on cue, the heavy stained glass windows flanking the front of the mansion suddenly lit up. The harsh strobing flashes of red and blue emergency lights sliced through the darkness outside, illuminating the grand ballroom in a chaotic, violent rhythm. The wail of federal sirens pierced the cold night air, growing louder and more deafening by the second until they completely surrounded the entire estate. The heavy mahogany double doors did not simply open. They were violently thrust apart, hitting the interior walls with a concussive boom that made the remaining crystal on the catering tables vibrate. A tidal wave of federal agents poured into the grand ballroom. Men and women in dark windbreakers emblazoned with the bright yellow letters of the FBI and the SEC flooded the aisles, fanning out with absolute military precision. Their radios squawked sharply, cutting through the stunned silence of the Boston elite. Nobody moved. The city's wealthiest power brokers, developers, and politicians instinctively shrank back, pressing themselves against the silk wallpaper to clear a path. They were terrified of being caught in the blast radius. They knew that standing too close to a sinking corporate empire was a fatal mistake. The live string quartet players hurriedly packed their expensive instruments, scrambling off the elevated stage to avoid the advancing federal tide. I stood my ground at the podium, watching the chaos unfold with cold, deep satisfaction. The master file I had sent, the offshore routing numbers, the forged ledgers, the drained pension accounts had provided the authorities with everything they needed to secure immediate absolute warrants. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught a sudden frantic movement near the grand staircase. It was Marcus, the slick, high-priced corporate attorney who had spent the last decade burying my father's secrets and facilitating Maya's offshore fraud. He had always prided himself on being the smartest man in the room, the untouchable legal mastermind. But right now he looked like a terrified rat fleeing a sinking ship. He had abandoned his signature smug smile and was desperately attempting to slip sideways through the swinging kitchen doors, hoping to escape through the service exit before the agent secured the perimeter. He did not make it. Two heavily built FBI agents intercepted him just as his hand touched the brass handle of the kitchen door. They moved with terrifying speed, grabbing Marcus by the shoulders of his tailored Italian suit and slamming him hard against the nearest marble pillar. The impact knocked the wind out of him. "You cannot do this!" Marcus gasped, his voice breathless and high-pitched. "I am legal counsel. I have attorney-client privilege. You are violating federal procedure." An older SEC investigator in a sharp gray suit stepped forward, holding up a thick stack of printed warrants. Attorney-client privilege does not cover active ongoing conspiracy to commit federal wire fraud. Marcus, the investigator stated, his voice echoing clearly over the commotion. "We have the decrypted Cayman Island transfer logs. Turn around and put your hands behind your back. You are under arrest." The metallic clink of handcuffs snapping shut around Marcus' wrists echoed like a gunshot. The brilliant, untouchable lawyer was dragged away, his head bowed, his career entirely decimated in a matter of seconds. I turned my attention back to the center of the room. Julian was watching his attorney being hauled out the doors, and the last remaining shred of his fragile ego completely shattered. The reality of his absolute ruin finally crushed him. The golden boy of Boston real estate, the man who had mocked me, humiliated me, and thrown me into the street, suddenly realized he was going to spend the rest of his life in a federal penitentiary. Julian let out a pathetic whimpering sound. His legs simply gave out. He dropped heavily to his knees right in the middle of the dance floor, his expensive tuxedo pants absorbing the spilled champagne from the shattered glasses. He did not look at the authorities. He did not look at the stunned investors who used to hang on his every word. He looked up at his wife. "Maya," he pleaded, his voice cracking into a desperate, pathetic sob. "Maya, you have to fix this. Call the governor. Call the senators. Use the contingency funds. You told me we were protected. You promised me they could never trace the bridge loans. Do something, Maya, please." He reached out, grabbing handfuls of her severe black designer gown, pulling at the fabric like a terrified child begging his mother for protection. It was the most pathetic display of cowardice I had ever witnessed. Maya did not look down at her sobbing husband. She did not reach out to comfort him or reassure him. She simply ripped the fabric of her gown out of his desperate grasp, treating him like a piece of garbage she had accidentally stepped on. Her cold, calculating executive armor was entirely gone. Her face was contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. She ignored the advancing federal agents completely. She ignored the flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the crystal chandeliers. Her eyes were locked exclusively on me. She marched toward the stage, her high heels clicking aggressively against the wood. She stopped at the bottom of the steps, looking up at me with absolute venom. The veins in her forehead were pulsing, and her breath came in ragged, furious gasps. "You think you have won?" she hissed, her voice vibrating with a dark, lethal rage. "You think handing over some decrypted ledgers makes you a genius? I am Maya Thorne. I have personal connections with half the federal judges in this state. I have legal shields buried so deep the SEC will spend 10 years trying to untangle them. I will hire the most vicious defense attorneys on the Eastern Seaboard. I will tie you up in litigation for the rest of your life. I will drag you through civil court until you are completely bankrupt and begging for mercy." I did not back away. I walked slowly down the wooden steps, closing the distance between us until I was standing inches from her flushed, furious face. The federal agents were securing the room, spreading out to block the exits, but I paid them no attention. This was the exact moment I had planned for. This was the absolute climax of my revenge. I smiled. It was a terrifying, razor-sharp smile that made the fierce, confident fire in her eyes suddenly falter. I leaned in close, my voice dropping to a smooth, lethal whisper, meant only for her ears. "You can't," I said, pronouncing every single syllable with devastating clarity. "I used the $43 million to buy the debt of your offshore shell company. I own your fraudulent assets, Maya. I own you." The silence between us was absolute. Maya Thorne, the brilliant, ruthless architect of a $200 million corporate theft, simply stopped breathing. Her eyes glazed over as the sheer monumental scale of her defeat finally registered. I had not just burned her empire to the ground. I had legally purchased the ashes. An FBI agent stepped up behind her, placing a heavy hand on her shoulder. "Maya Thorne," he stated, his voice devoid of any emotion. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and conspiracy. You have the right to remain silent." As they pulled her hands behind her back and secured the steel handcuffs, her eyes remained locked on mine, completely broken and entirely defeated. I stood tall, watching the authorities drag her and my sobbing brother out of the grand ballroom and into the cold, flashing lights of the Boston night. The Thorne legacy was finally over, and I was the one holding the keys. The morning sun broke through the heavy velvet curtains of the master suite, casting long, sharp shadows across the imported Persian rugs. I stood by the massive bay windows of the Thorne estate, holding a steaming cup of black coffee, watching the Boston skyline awaken. The television mounted on the far wall was muted, but the bright red breaking news banners flashed incessantly across the bottom of the screen. The financial networks were having an absolute field day. The spectacular implosion of Thorne Global dominated every single channel and every major headline. Helicopter footage showed federal agents carrying dozens of heavy cardboard boxes and computer servers out of the downtown corporate headquarters. The news anchor's face was grim as she detailed the staggering scale of the $200 million Ponzi scheme. Julian and Maya Thorne had faced a federal magistrate at dawn, wearing matching orange jumpsuits. Given the extreme flight risk and the sheer volume of offshore shell accounts they possessed, the judge had completely denied bail. They were remanded to federal custody awaiting trial. The mighty real estate empire they had built on a foundation of lies was officially in receivership, seized by the government to begin paying back the countless victims they had brazenly defrauded. The invincible Thorne legacy was now nothing but a cautionary tale of catastrophic greed. My cell phone vibrated violently against the mahogany nightstand. It had not stopped buzzing since midnight. I picked it up, watching the notifications cascade down the illuminated screen. The same extended family members who had spent the last decade treating me like a contagious disease were now flooding my inbox with desperate, pathetic affection. I tapped the voicemail icon and listened to the frantic voice of my Uncle Henry. This was the same man who had laughed uproariously when Julian threw me out of the estate, telling me I was a genetic disappointment who lacked the killer instinct required to be a true thorn. He used to joke that I was only fit to fetch coffee for the real executives. Now his tone was sickeningly sweet. He was practically begging me to forgive past misunderstandings and casually mentioning that his own commercial properties were facing immediate foreclosure. He needed a massive bridge loan from his absolute favorite niece. I deleted the message before he could even finish the sentence. Next was a long, rambling text from Aunt Beatrice. 5 years ago, she had publicly humiliated me at the annual country club gala, loudly declaring that my cheap clothes were an embarrassment to the family name and demanding I sit at the overflow table with the hired catering staff. Her message this morning was a masterpiece of frantic revisionist history. She claimed she had always secretly supported my ambitions. She insisted she always knew Julian and Maya were unstable, and begged me to protect her monthly trust fund distributions, now that I was in complete control of the remaining assets. She even had the audacity to ask if I would consider hiring her lazy, incompetent son as an executive vice president in the new holding company. The hypocrisy was absolutely staggering. For my entire life, they had measured my worth purely by my bank account and my blind obedience to Julian. They had eagerly participated in my exile, cheering as I was stripped of my dignity because it secured their own comfortable positions in the family hierarchy. Now that the power dynamic had violently shifted, they were perfectly willing to completely abandon Julian and bow to me. They were parasites desperately searching for a new host to latch onto. I set the phone to do not disturb and dropped it back onto the nightstand. I had absolutely no intention of throwing them a lifeline. They could sink with the ship they had so willingly helped build. I turned away from the phone and walked toward the master bathroom, preparing to dress for my upcoming meeting with the federal receivership team. But before I could cross the expansive room, the landline on the bedside table rang. It was a sharp, piercing sound that cut through the quiet morning. Only a handful of people had access to the estate's secure internal lines. I picked up the heavy receiver and held it to my ear. An automated robotic voice echoed through the speaker. "You have a collect call from an inmate at the Suffolk County Federal Correctional Institution. Press 1 to accept." I pressed the button. The line clicked and hissed with static. Chloe, the voice on the other end, was a ragged, desperate croak. It was Julian. He sounded completely destroyed. There was no trace of the arrogant, towering real estate tycoon who had commanded the ballroom last night. He sounded like a terrified, hollow shell. "Chloe, please do not hang up!" Julian sobbed, his breath hitching wildly as panic constricted his throat. "It is an absolute nightmare in here. They took my suit. They put me in a freezing concrete holding cell with violent criminals. Maya will not even speak to me. Her defense lawyers are already throwing all the blame onto me to secure her a plea deal. They are going to lock me away in federal prison forever." I listened to his frantic hyperventilating without offering a single word of comfort. "You have the money, Chloe," he pleaded, his voice rising to a high, hysterical pitch. "You have the 43 million. You own the debt. You can fix this entire mess. You can post a bond for me. You can hire the best defense team in the city to get me out of here. I will do whatever you want. I will sign over anything you ask for. Please, Chloe, we share the same blood. Our father would not want this. We are family. You cannot just leave me here to rot. We are family." I listened to the desperate, frantic breathing echoing through the plastic receiver of my bedroom landline. Julian was hyperventilating, repeating the word family over and over again, like a magic spell he thought could instantly erase a lifetime of abuse. For a moment, I said absolutely nothing. I let the heavy silence stretch across the line, forcing him to sit with the crushing weight of his new reality. Then I slowly lowered the receiver back onto its base, cutting off his pathetic sobbing with a sharp, definitive click. I did not go back to sleep. I walked into my massive walk-in closet and selected a sharp-tailored charcoal suit. If Julian and Maya wanted a family reunion, they were going to get one. I was going to look them in the eye when I closed the coffin on their empire. The Suffolk County Federal Correctional Institution was a bleak, brutalist structure of concrete and razor wire sitting like a gray scar against the morning sky. It was a place designed to strip away power and arrogance. As I walked through the heavily guarded entrance, my heels clicked rhythmically against the scuffed linoleum floor. The air smelled of industrial bleach and stale sweat, a sharp contrast to the suffocating orchid perfume and vintage champagne of the ballroom just hours prior. I surrendered my phone and designer bag to the sullen guard at the front desk before being escorted down a long fluorescent-lit corridor toward the secure visitation wing. The visitor side of the holding area was a row of cramped metal stools facing thick, smudged plexiglass. I took my seat and waited. A heavy steel door on the opposite side buzzed and swung open. Two federal marshals escorted them into the partitioned booth. The sight was staggering. The invincible Thorne couple had been entirely erased. Maya was unrecognizable. The flawless blowout and severe designer gowns were gone, replaced by a cheap, oversized orange jumpsuit that swallowed her frame. Her face was scrubbed clean of makeup, revealing deep, dark circles and a gaunt, hollow expression. She looked at me once, her eyes entirely vacant, utterly defeated, before she sank onto the metal stool and stared blankly at her handcuffed wrists. The venomous corporate shark had been completely broken. Julian was in far worse shape. He scrambled toward the glass, his hands manacled to a thick waist chain. His eyes were bloodshot and wild, darting around the small concrete room like a trapped animal. He fumbled with the heavy black telephone receiver on the wall, pressing it against his ear with trembling fingers. I slowly picked up my receiver. "Chloe," he gasped, his voice cracking instantly. "Thank God. I knew you would come. I knew you would understand. The bail hearing is in 2 hours. You just need to authorize a wire transfer to my defense firm. They can have me out by noon. Maya has her own counsel, but you have to help me. I am your brother." I stared at his sweaty, desperate face. I thought back to the cold, raining night our father died in his hospital bed. I had spent 48 hours straight holding Richard's hand, while his lungs failed, watching the man who built an empire slowly fade into nothing. When the monitor flatlined, and the nurses finally pulled the sheet over his face, I had walked out into the freezing hospital corridor, completely numb and broken. Julian had arrived 30 minutes later, smelling of expensive scotch and wearing a tuxedo from a gala he refused to leave early. When I asked him for a ride back to the estate, because my car was blocked in the hospital garage, he had scoffed. He looked at his diamond watch, told me he had a post-gala celebration to attend, and casually told me to try an Uber before turning his back and walking away. "You are my brother," I repeated, my voice dangerously quiet, carrying easily through the secure line. "You love using that word now, Julian. Family. Blood. You use it when you are backed into a corner and need someone to absorb the blow." He pressed his forehead against the smudged glass, his breathing ragged. "I am sorry," he pleaded, tears spilling over his eyelashes and tracking down his pale cheeks. "I will give you whatever you want, Chloe. I will step down from the board. I will sign a full public confession. I will transfer all my voting shares directly to you. Just please get me out of here. I cannot survive in this place. I am a thorn. We do not belong in cages." "You stopped being a thorn the moment you leveraged our father's legacy to pay off your underground gambling debts," I stated, my tone entirely devoid of pity or hesitation. "You stopped being family the moment you and Maya forged pension documents to steal the retirements of the very people who built your empire. You are exactly where you belong." Maya slowly lifted her head. She did not reach for her receiver. She just stared at me through the thick glass, her shoulders slumped. There was no more fight left in her. She knew the game was completely over. She knew I held every single card, every offshore ledger, and every piece of encrypted evidence required to put them away for decades. Julian began to sob openly, hitting his forehead against the partition. "Please, Chloe, what am I supposed to do? I have nothing left. No lawyers will take my calls. My accounts are completely frozen. How am I supposed to fight this?" I stood up from the metal stool, smoothing a microscopic crease from my charcoal suit jacket. I looked at the man who had spent his entire life trying to make me feel invisible. You told me to try an Uber when Richard died, I said, delivering the words with absolute cold precision. I suggest you try a public defender. I did not wait for his response. I placed the black receiver gently onto the metal ledge, leaving the line open so he could scream my name into the empty air. I turned my back on the glass partition and walked away. The heavy steel door of the visitation room buzzed and locked behind me, sealing them inside their concrete tomb forever. I did not look back. The toxic cord that had bound me to their cruelty was finally violently severed. I walked down the long corridor, retrieving my personal items from the front desk and pushing through the heavy double doors of the federal facility. The morning air hit my face crisp and remarkably clean. The sun was fully up now, burning away the lingering fog over the Boston harbor. The world felt entirely new, as if a heavy, suffocating storm had finally broken. As I walked down the concrete steps toward my waiting car, my phone buzzed heavily in my hand. It was a high-priority alert from my private legal counsel. I unlocked the screen and read the official secure notification. The federal magistrate had reviewed the evidence I submitted overnight. The state had formally unfrozen all of my personal and offshore accounts. More importantly, the judge had signed the emergency motion recognizing me as the sole legitimate creditor of Thorn Global and all its subsidiary assets. The entire empire, every building, every holding company, every single dime of clean capital now belonged legally and exclusively to me. The crisp morning air whipping off the harbor felt incredibly clean as I stared at the digital confirmation illuminating my phone screen. The federal magistrate had completely validated my position. The state had formally unfrozen every single one of my personal and offshore accounts, but more importantly, the judge had signed the emergency motion officially recognizing me as the sole legitimate creditor of Thorn Global. Every remaining asset, every holding company, every single dime of clean capital now belonged exclusively to me. I took a deep breath, letting the reality of my absolute victory settle into my bones before slipping the phone back into my pocket and walking toward my waiting town car. The weeks that immediately followed the raid were a masterclass in systematic corporate dismantling. Julian and Maya were completely denied bail. Their faces, once splashed across the society pages of elite magazines, were now permanently fixed on the evening news broadcasts behind tall chain-link fences. Julian attempted to call me from lockup exactly 3 times, sobbing into the heavy plastic receiver and begging for me to post a bond citing our shared blood. I blocked the prison facilities number on the 4th attempt. Maya took a rapid plea deal that would keep her in a federal penitentiary well into her 70s, desperately trying to avoid a lengthy public trial that would expose the true depths of her sociopathy. I did not visit them. I did not send defense lawyers. I let them rot in the exact concrete cages they had built for themselves. The collateral damage among the extended family was absolute poetry. The aunts, uncles, and cousins who had spent the last decade mocking my clothes, sneering at my background, and eagerly participating in my exile, suddenly found themselves entirely cut off. Their monthly trust fund distributions were immediately frozen by the federal receivership. Uncle Henry lost his commercial properties to foreclosure within 30 days. Aunt Beatrice was forced to sell her luxury vehicles and downsize to a modest apartment. My phone rang incessantly with their desperate, tearful voicemails begging for emergency loans and pleading for forgiveness. I changed my number and instructed my private security team to turn them away at the gates. They were leeches, and the host was officially dead. Meanwhile, I walked into the downtown Thorn Global headquarters, not as a grieving marginalized relative, but as the sole executioner. The board of directors desperately attempted to offer me the position of chief executive officer. They sat in the glass-walled conference room, sweating through their silk ties, begging me to save the brand and keep the corporate structure intact. I fired every single one of them. I had absolutely no intention of sitting at the head of a poisoned table. Thorn Global was a monument to Richard's ambition, but it had been entirely infected by Julian's staggering incompetence and Maya's malignant greed. It was a rotting structure, and I completely refused to live inside it. Instead, I hired a ruthless team of independent liquidators. We carved up the empire piece by piece. We sold off the massive commercial high-rises, the luxury residential developments, and the overseas holdings. We compensated the swindled pension funds, returning the stolen capital to the working-class employees who had been bled dry. Once the debts were settled and the federal fines were paid, I liquidated the remaining clean assets and transferred the staggering billions directly into my secure private accounts. Thorn Global ceased to exist. The massive brass letters were ripped down from the downtown skyscraper. The legacy was completely erased. But my work was only just beginning. Sitting in the courtroom watching Maya desperately try to hide her fraudulent offshore transfers had sparked something entirely new inside me. I possessed an intimate, lethal understanding of how corporate criminals operated. I knew exactly how they hid money. I knew how they manipulated ledgers. I knew exactly where to look for the invisible digital threads that unravel entire empires. I used the remaining capital to launch my own firm. It was not a real estate holding company. It was an elite private forensic accounting and corporate investigation agency. I hired former SEC agents, aggressive financial analysts, and ruthless legal minds. We dedicated ourselves entirely to dismantling corporate fraudsters. We became the apex predators of the financial world, hunting down corrupt executives who believed they were untouchable. We tore apart shell companies and exposed massive Ponzi schemes with surgical precision. Within 6 months, my firm was the most feared name on Wall Street. Billion-dollar corporations terrified of an audit would immediately settle the moment they saw my heavy cardstock letterhead. Now, 1 year later, I stood on the sprawling stone balcony of the reclaimed Thorn estate. The federal government had seized the mansion during the initial raid, but I had simply purchased it back at the absolute bottom of the market during the liquidation auction. I did not buy it for sentimental reasons. I bought it as a massive physical trophy. I bought it to prove that the outcast, the forgotten widow, the woman they tried to discard into the street had ultimately swallowed them whole. The evening air was cool and crisp, carrying the faint, briny scent of the nearby ocean. I leaned against the heavy marble balustrade looking out over the manicured grounds. The estate was completely silent. There were no fake society galas. There were no whispering, manipulative relatives drinking expensive champagne on my lawn. The toxic parasites had been entirely eradicated from my life. I raised a crystal glass of deep red wine, watching the dying sunlight catch the dark liquid. The sky above the Boston Harbor was burning in brilliant shades of orange and purple. It looked exactly like the watercolor painting Richard had bought for me the night we first met. I thought about him then. I thought about the terrified, dying man who had used his last ounce of strength to transfer that initial $43 million to me. It had not been just an inheritance. It had been a weapon. It had been his final, profound act of love and his ultimate desperate plea for justice. He had trusted me to burn the rot away. I took a slow, appreciative sip of the wine. The vintage was perfect. The silence was absolute. I looked down at my hands resting against the cold stone. They were not shaking. They were steady, highly capable, and immensely powerful. I had walked into this nightmare as a grieving widow entirely surrounded by vicious wolves. I had walked out as the architect of my own flawless justice. The Thorn Empire was dead, but I was truly, finally alive. This narrative powerfully illustrates that achieving true moral resolution often requires severing toxic familial bonds. Chloe's evolution from a marginalized widow to a formidable forensic accountant proves that our inherent worth is not defined by those who belittle us, but by our resilience in the face of deep betrayal. Family blood does not excuse corporate greed or emotional abuse. Ultimately, walking away from a poisoned empire is sometimes the only path to building a clean, authentic legacy. Share your own stories of overcoming toxic environments and leave a comment below.